Hey there, class. So this is the beginning of our last module for our literary units. We're looking at literature from 1945 through present day. I will say honestly that this is one of my more challenging modules to develop simply because there's so much great literature from 1945 through present day that it's hard to pick and choose which ones we're going to talk about in these next few weeks. So this module does run a little bit longer. I dedicate 5 weeks to it as opposed to the 4 that we had previously been doing. So we will cover several different literary movements and genres of writing within these 5 weeks. So what I've done for the first week of the module is I focused on the 1950s, and I picked 2 literary movements that were brief but were influential later on in other writings. So the 2 that we're working on this module, it's New Criticism and then the Beat Generation. So let me start with New Criticism. We have been doing in our analysis small bits of literary criticism, but literary criticism itself, it's really a whole movement where critics decide how to approach literature. So there's things like feminism, modernism, reader response, the list goes on and on of the different types of criticism that there is to develop. Prior to this date, most literature critics focused on what influenced the writing itself. So they took into context the author's background, and they took into context history. And we talked about this in class too, so this isn't anything new. We talked about the role that society played. We've talked about the role like race issues, class issues, especially in the Gilded Age. We talked a lot about that. So we looked at what was going on outside the writing and how that influenced what the author was writing about inside the writing. Well, New Criticism, they looks at specifically the writing itself and nothing else. So these critics believe that you did not need anything beyond the writing. I could hand you a poem right now, tell you to read it, and you should be able to understand it without knowing anything about the author or the year or the context that it was written in. So as you can imagine, this is a unique take in that these critics did not care about anything beyond the writing itself. They firmly believed that you could read anything and find the meaning in it without knowing anything else about it. Now, that's not to say that they completely disregarded everything else, but that was always secondary. So they found their meaning first. Once their meaning was found, then they could research beyond what the author had presented in his or her work. The New Critics, it was born out of really one professor really took off with it, and within that field there were several writers that emerged. And so what we're doing here is we're going to read some of the poets that were first critics, and then they started to write their poems with that belief that they're going to share with you this moment. You should be able to understand and identify with the moment and understand its meaning without knowing too much about them. So the reason that this really didn't last very long, it's really not that it's flawed, it's just that most readers are really wanting to know more about what they're reading as opposed to just that brief window. So it was short-lived because it wasn't fully appreciated, but it is influential because when the 60s started, and we had the hippie movements, and we had this whole socialization experiments of many kind, new critics lend to what became known as reader response, which is what most of us really do when we read, which is that our experiences influence our interpretation of the writing. And so although reader response was a rejection in a sense of what these critics had said, it really built up on that. And plus, this movement gave us some really great poets, and that we're going to read some of them. So I presented 3 different authors. I really encourage you to listen to the reading of My Papa's Waltz. It's not often, we're entering a time now that we are going to be able to hear directly from some of these authors, and in this particular one, the author reads the poem himself. So I always think it's interesting to, after you read a poem, and then to hear how the author would read it. Sometimes it really lends to a different interpretation of what you may have initially thought that poem was about. My Papa's Waltz is a great example of that. So that's part one. The second part of this module is the beat generation. And I warned you before how much I love the Lost Generation and I love the Harlem Renaissance. So I really love the beat generation. The beat generation, to me, is very similar to the Lost Generation, except perhaps more drugged out. So the Lost Generation had their alcohol, the beat generation had their pot. And they were more than okay with that. So the beat generation is very short-lived, probably 1955 to 1960s. And the reason why it really died out, and which we're going to talk about more, is those people really became focal voices of what became known as the hippie movement. But we'll just talk about the beat generation itself. So the beat generation itself, as most literary movements, started with just a group of friends that were sitting around, and they were realizing that they wanted to start some sort of social movement. So Allen Ginsberg has really been given the main voice of this particular movement. Jack Kerouac is the second voice, and they were friends in college. And together they decided that they were going to spark some sort of revolution. You got to remember the times that it's been written in. But they were going to do it through literature. And what they were going to do is they were going to write without any of those old constraints that had previously been given to authors. So they were going to take writing and they were just going to write whatever came to their mind. They weren't going to worry about censoring themselves. And this is one of the big deals with the Beat generation, is it really took away that idea of censorship, because they would write about exactly what they were thinking and exactly what they were experiencing. And they believed and insisted that it should be published and read exactly as they had it. So they really fought against those notions of censorship. Within the Beat generation, where their influence is really seen still today is in some of those themes that they addressed in their writing. So I mentioned that they wanted to really radicalize themselves. So they picked what would be considered topics at the time to be more radical. So for instance, homosexuality is a topic of theirs. Allen Ginsberg was a gay writer. He was one of the openly gay writers of his time. So homosexuality is a large theme in their writing, in the sense of that it's not that big of a deal. People are gay and that's fine. And so they write about that a lot, and their characters are, they introduce homosexual characters and this was not the norm before that. So that was something brand new to them. They also wrote about African Americans, and that there was a need for racial equality. Again, something that would be considered pretty controversial for the time, because we're talking 1955 to the early 1960s. So this is, of course, pre-civil rights movement. So they were very outspoken individuals for that time when it came to race equality. They also talked a lot about that idea of rejecting society and finding yourself. If you read through the book, it talks a little bit about how many of them became part of the Buddhist religion, because that was part of their belief, that they were just going to experiment and find themselves, and they were going to experiment in whichever way they wanted to and write about whatever they wanted to. So in Allen Ginsberg's case, he became this voice of the Beat generation. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, he then becomes a large voice of what's known as the hippie movement in the 60s. Jack Kerouac is sort of a hero of the Beat generation for his novel On the Road. Maybe you've read it, maybe you've come across it. But On the Road, it's really, although it's fiction, it's autobiographical. Sorry about that. Of a trip that he had taken with his friends. And he just writes about really things that they encounter. But the theme of that is that he's trying to reject what was I guess, his father's role of his life and what his father had thought he was going to be. And instead he takes this road trip and he encounters all these people and all these women, and there was that notion that you don't have to be what your parents tell you to be, that you can just get out, drive, and find yourself. So it is similar to the Lost Generation in that sense. The Beat Generation does not last long, not because they weren't great writers, but because, as I mentioned at the beginning, there were wandering spirits. So wandering spirits tend not to stay committed to one cause for long. So they became very active in other causes at the time, especially civil rights movements, the conversations about drugs, conversations about homosexuality, individualism. So they became social figures, and they honestly just didn't have time to write as much as they perhaps once did. But that's not to say that they dropped the causes. They just went on and did them in other ways. So their writing is influential because it inspired so much in the 60s. And especially Jack Kerouac's novel really picked up in the 60s as this idea of just saying what you want to say and not worrying about what people may think. And then, of course, a lot of critics look at them as they fought so hard about censorship that they didn't want to be censored, that's a large influence of what came later after them. So we're going to read some of Ginsberg's poetry and a chapter from On the Road. It's just a chapter. The novel itself, it will give you an idea of what the novel is about, but if you're ever interested, I think it's a great novel, but you can probably tell by now what some of my taste is. If you have any questions or concerns over this week's readings, please just let me know. And then in addition to the readings, we're just going to do a discussion. This one's a little bit different because I'm asking you more about which one you liked and why you liked it, and then how that story represents what you think those two movements are about. So hopefully you enjoy them. But again, if you have any questions, just let me know.